So, as promised, what we're looking at today is going to be America's involvement in World War II. So the question is, how do we react to this World War starting? And the simple answer to that is, we don't want to be a part of it. We want to remain neutral. And it's hard to blame America for this because we're dealing with the Great Depression. And so we don't want to rush off and join some war that deals with European problems and impacts them. We're going to worry about our own thing, which is quintessentially American. Like, that is what America history has been so far. It has been, I don't want to get involved in other people's issues. I'm going to worry about me. This is one of the very few times in this class where I can say, we learned from history. But America learns from the problems of World War I and how they ended up getting dragged into the war and decide to, not do that. So you have Neutrality Acts that are passed. The Neutrality Act of 1935 authorizes the president to prohibit arms sales and U.S. travel to belligerent nations. So that means we are going to limit who we're selling guns to, right? Arms, stuff for war, which, wasn't that the problem in World War I? Yeah, that was a problem in World War I. Germany didn't like that we were overwhelmingly selling to Britain and France, and so they used their U-boats to sink our ships. All right, check. Deal with that problem. And then there's the issue of preventing U.S. travel to belligerent nations. Remember that Lusitania thing? There was a problem there. What was that problem? Oh, that problem was we had Americans on these British ships that were passenger ships that they were actually secretly using to transport weapons, and then we ended up having Americans die. And then we got stuck in the situation of like, what do we do? Now you've killed Americans. Great, we'll prevent that from happening. We won't let Americans get on these ships. The Neutrality Act of 1936 forbids the extensions of loans or credits to belligerent nations. We're not going to extend the loans and the credits like we had said that we did during World War I because, well, that led us to helping one side more than the other. So we were like, let's not do this at all. Makes sense. A Neutrality Act of 1937 forbids the shipment of arms to opposing sides in civil war. We are not going to send goods to any side that is involved in that civil war in Spain. We're going to stay back. We do not want to get involved in this. Remember, the problem was in the shipping of our goods, so we don't want to do that. So the stuff America is doing, these are all directly preventing the stuff that brought us into World War I. That seems like a pretty solid situation. The problem is that becomes untenable once real World War II sets in. So America starts easing restrictions a little bit. So we'll get cash and carry in 1939. So this is saying that belligerent nations are allowed to buy weapons from us, but they have to pay for them in cash, right? We're not doing loans, cash. And then they need to transport it away themselves. Carry, cash and carry. So, all right, we'll sell arms to you, but we're still not going to do loans, and we're still not going to ship it. You have to get it yourself. Now, this overwhelmingly favors Britain because, I mean, they're closer to us, right? We have a better relationship with them in general, so this favors them. The problem becomes Britain starts running out of money for this. And it's really important to keep in mind when we ended the other day, Europe was screwed. Like, literally, Germany is right up against England. They're at the English Channel. They are doing the Blitz on London and other areas where they're just flying their bombers over and bombing the crap out of England. And England desperately needs help, and they start running out of, cash for this. So we move to Lend-Lease, which is we will let them obtain arms on credit. The idea being like we're lending it to them, we're leasing it to them, so it's not truly a loan. They're going to give it back, but you're not giving ammunition back, so we're fudging it a little bit, specifically for Britain. And there will be the Atlantic Charter. This is in August of 1941. There's a secret meeting between Churchill and FDR where they will agree on aspects of what peace after war could look like. World War II is like World War I. World War I, we wanted to be involved in the peace negotiations, and we weren't allowed to, and now we're saying, look, World War II has happened because we weren't involved. So before we even get involved in this, we want to play a part in this. Those focuses are self-determination. Yeah, we saw that last time. No territorial expansion. I kind of saw that last time. I mean, a little bit more of like a self-determination-y, like the nations get to pick. But in this case, it kind of makes sense. Don't let these people or these countries expand. And then free trade, which was also something that was a focus after World War I. Now, I want to be clear, FDR was kind of against this war. He was really public of like, we're not going to get involved. We don't want to get involved. American sentiment is not to get involved. But he pitches this as, we actually might have a problem with World War II. So before, we weren't going to be impacted by it. But as you see Hitler kind of take over Europe, you're facing Hitler and an agreement with the Soviet Union, and they're kind of taking over most of the world at this point. And so America is afraid, not so much that they themselves are going to have to like face an actual attack. They're worried about how that could impact us economically. And that's going to be where FDR starts going, we might actually have to get involved in this. So how does America actively get involved in World War II? And I feel like you know the answer to this already, and the correct answer is Pearl Harbor. So for all the conversations that we have about the subtle shifting of foreign policy and the communication of that FDR is trying to focus to kind of shift the American public's view of getting involved in the war, Pearl Harbor happened. And then you can be like, well, Japan bad, they attacked us, so let's fight them. And then ultimately, this is going to lead to a declaration of war by us against Japan. And then Germany declares war against us. And we're like, all right, we're involved. So we are going to talk about the two different fronts of the war, the two theaters, the Pacific theater and the European theater. And the thing that gets the most history around it, and usually the most knowledge, is the European front, right? Because that deals with the Nazis. Yeah, I mean, we have a quicker ending to the European front. There is obviously that Hitler component. But we are going to see really the ending of the Pacific theater being the thing that really is going to shift a lot of American foreign policy. So that is still significant. So let's talk about the alliances here, because we have kind of a unique formation of this. So you see on the screen there, these are the big three. So you have Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, and they will meet several times during the war, and we'll talk about some of those big summits. I really like this picture of them. Before I even get into this, I really want to establish them as people and their interaction, because it is going to shape, I mean, the next, I don't know, 50 years. So Churchill's there on the far left. Churchill is, you know, kind of a bulldog. He's the British persona. You know, he's got his famous speech around the Dunkirk evacuation about how we will live to fight another day. And it's important to keep in mind, like, the view of British people at this point is like, literally they're dealing with this bombing campaign by the British. Things are not great. They feel like they're alone. And so there is this kind of, you know, darker view of British thing of like, we will grit our teeth and get through it, as opposed to FDR, who gets to be a little bit more of like a facilitator between these two sides. Then you have Stalin, the Soviet Union. He is going to be surprise attacked by Hitler, right? So I say surprise because, like, I feel like you can make an argument that, like, yeah, it was probably coming. There is a lot of kind of history about Stalin that I won't really get into for our purposes, but there is something that he's like a very paranoid person. You can see that throughout all his purges and things like that. And he does not handle the invasion well. He goes missing for a pretty significant period of time, and like Germany just kind of is running roughshod over you know, the poor Soviet Union. But he'll eventually get out of that and then really just throw human beings at places like Leningrad and Stalingrad and really try and, you know, hold off the Nazis. And that's where you get all your memes about don't invade Russia in the winter and whatnot. But I do want to emphasize the reason that this is such a problem ultimately for Germany is literally the Soviet Union would just throw people at problems. And I think a great representation of this, and I do recommend watching this, there's a miniseries on HBO called Chernobyl, which is about the Chernobyl reactor and its explosion and meltdown and all of that. And you really get a good sense in how the Soviet system worked. So we'll deal with this a little bit more when we get to the Cold War, when it kind of kicks off following World War II. But there is this emphasis that the Soviet Unions have that they're like, well, people are expendable and we can use people to solve these problems, even if they die. And that was like, they're okay with that. And that's going to be one of the reasons why ultimately Germany isn't able to take over the Soviet Union. But it puts the Soviet Union's on American side. Churchill does not like Stalin in the slightest. He is going to be one of the firmest advocates against this Soviet Union communist socialist like ideology that is being perfected, shall we say, in the Soviet Union. And he's going to go along with this alliance primarily because FDR does a really good job of like keeping both sides engaged. Stalin doesn't like Churchill. Churchill doesn't like Stalin. But FDR is able to kind of work with them. And so there are a couple of meetings with them that are very significant. And then ultimately FDR is going to die. Spoiler alert. And then Truman will come in. So you have the Tehran Conference, which is in November of 1943. The Soviets... we want the Soviets to create a second front. We want them to kind of have this big pushback so that, look, the reality of the situation is there is no two fronts because it's really just Britain as their little island trying to like do something to the areas of France that the Germans have, and that's kind of hard to do. So we really want this aggressive push by the Soviet Union. And Stalin's like, you do it. You start a second front. I don't want to do this. I'm dealing with all these other problems. And so there is this back and forth over what are we going to do. We'll get to that strategy in a minute in talking about how ultimately we do open up the European front. They'll have the Yalta Conference. This is a couple years later, February of 1945. This is a big one about how are we going to end the war and divide up post-war Europe. And this is going to be really where you see Churchill and Stalin butt heads. Stalin wants to create a buffer zone, essentially, where he can gobble up a lot of those Eastern European states, use them as being part of the Soviet Union, and really use them as like a buffer against invasion because he's worried about that, because, I mean, it kind of happened. But he also wants the really significant industrial capacity that Germany can offer. And so he really wants to push as far and take as much as he can. And Churchill does not want to accept that. When you have the Potsdam Conference, which is a couple months later, FDR has died and Truman is the president now. A lot of interesting stuff around that. We'll get to Truman a little bit later in the unit, but Truman has been the vice president and like no one like really wanted him, but like he's been a vice president for a few months and then FDR dies and then everyone's like, wait, who's the president? Truman? What does he know? He was just in the Senate for some time. Like, what are we doing? And FDR actually had worked really hard to like keep Truman from being involved in a lot of stuff. And so Truman literally just kind of shows up and is like, I guess I'm the president now and I'm dealing with a world war. And then, oh, we have this huge new weapon that we haven't ever had before. And they learn of a successful test, the first successful test, when Truman is at this Potsdam Conference. And the British were a part of this. They knew, but we hadn't told the Soviet Union. And so he kind of drops this little nugget at that conference of like, ha, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I got this really cool super weapon that you guys don't know about. And that Truman and Stalin do not see eye to eye. Truman does not step in and take that same position that FDR had. And so you are going to see this relationship kind of deteriorate over time, especially because Churchill is able to wield a little bit more power in getting a movement against Stalin. But the main thing they focused on is how are they going to get this peace agreement with Germany? So the strategy in the European theater is kind of like just to squeeze. So you want Stalin to move in from the east. You want to open up a second front with an invasion from England. And then we also want to move up from the south through Italy. So these are some of the significant battles that you'll see. El Alamein in North Africa. This is going to prevent German control of the Suez Canal. There are some movies that kind of deal with this. Is a little bit more of a tank-heavy battle in this area. So I think there's some movies that kind of handle that stuff. There's a lot of movies on World War II that you can watch. Stalingrad, which is where the Germans are ultimately going to begin retreating. Major losses on both sides. It's very significant, for us because now the Germans are taking really heavy losses, but it is also a lot of heavy losses for the Soviet Union, and we care a little bit less about that, right? Because we don't really care for them that much anyway, so we're willing to kind of overlook it. Ultimately, D-Day, I feel like you guys know about D-Day, but in Normandy, there's going to be an invasion. Eisenhower is going to lead this invasion. He's going to come around later as president, and that's both land and sea. Huge operation. Saving Private Ryan, the first 30 minutes of it are that, so feel free to watch that. To get a good sense of it. But we do kind of get a foothold in France, and this is the real turning point, because now we have another front, and we can start pushing in. And Germany really has spread themselves pretty thin. There's a lot of history that you can look up about Hitler and his decisions that he makes about the war that are kind of dumb, but no one really calls him out on it or says we shouldn't do this because they don't want to upset him. And just one of those problems you get with dictatorships and whatnot. And so this really is going to be the beginning of the end. The Battle of the Bulge is the final German offensive. And then essentially what you end up happening is just this squeeze in and then, you know, mass suicides and stuff like that. And then America and, well, really the Allies are going to work with the Soviet Union over how we're going to divide that up, and that'll ultimately lead to the Cold War. But again, we'll deal with that later. In the Pacific theater, our strategy is island hopping. One of the concerns is you can't just take over one piece of land and be done with it. You really have to jump from island to island, and all of this, the difficulty around a D-Day, right? Launching an amphibious assault, going from water into land when they have, you know, fortresses and the ability to, well, you know, boxes and things like that. It's just really hard to do, and we have to do that over and over and over again, and it does cost substantial lives. So we want to take strategic islands that are large enough for airfields, and then begin opening up shipping lanes, and then bombing raids, and start trying to move towards Japan that way. Battle of Midway, which I think a movie just came out about this. I haven't seen it, but Midway. That's where we will break the Japanese code. We use Navajo code talkers. We're going to look a little bit more at them later. And it is the turning point in the Pacific. You see that in 1942. Even though the war in the Pacific won't end then, there will be a stopping of a Japanese advance, and then we'll start kind of pushing our way there. I do want to point out the mentality of the Japanese is very dedicated on, I'm willing to sacrifice myself for my country. Very, very dedicated soldiers. There's kamikazes, like that whole 9 yards. They're willing to go to the end. And that makes winning difficult in that you can't just like be like, guys, it doesn't look good, you should surrender. They're like, no, I'm not going to do that. Battle of Iwo Jima is significant. You probably have seen that image of the soldiers hoisting the American flag. That is a key Japanese airfield. We're able to take that. But the Japanese still refuse to surrender, and that's going to be a big problem. We'll talk about this later, but how are we going to end this war when we're not in Japan, but we're kind of winning strategically? Like, what are they going to do? Are they going to give up? How do we get them to give up? And hint, we might have to use a super weapon. So there's the question of how did World War II change the United States on the home front? And that's what we're going to look at with these assignments on the home front. But I'll hit some kind of broad topics that we're going to see. One, the impact on women. There is an increased participation in the workforce. You'll see, you could say lightly propaganda, right? The Rosie the Riveter thing to try and get women to join these industrial jobs. And again, I want to emphasize this. We talk a lot about how can labor, how can women, how can groups of people get something that, or acceptance by an establishment, and it comes with leverage. We saw that we get that 8-hour workday because World War I happens and we need workers. So you kind of got to look out for them. World War II happens, we're sending a lot more soldiers over who are men. We need women to take these jobs. And so women are going to have some leverage in that situation. This is going to be a little bit different from World War I in that when the war ends, women are less likely to give those jobs back. What we generally saw after World War I was women stepped into jobs and then the war ended. They're like, all right. And they went back to what they had. And then we're going to see in this one, no, women want to stick around in that workforce. This also is an impact because domestically women are running the homes, and there is a V for victory focus. So you have victory gardens, you have all sorts of propaganda aimed around, you know, rationing. Again, I've mentioned this before. I talked to my grandmother about, this was for a COVID assignment. I mentioned, you know, hey, are there any things you can think of in your life where there have been restrictions placed by the government on what you can do? And she mentioned rationing that happened during the war. And yep, that sort of stuff happened. You were only allowed to get this amount of whatever, right? Sugar, meat, those sort of things. And you had, you know, meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, a focus on a, you know, public perspective or a public relations front about, all right, like, maybe refrain from doing this. And there was a big focus on we need these supplies for the soldiers, the boys who are overseas. And you see America kind of pitching in for that. Of course, we need to acknowledge the treatment of Japanese Americans, and this is internment. So basically, there is this huge fear after America is attacked that all Japanese people in America are secretly working for Japan and they're double agents and they're going to reveal all our secrets and then there's going to be attacks. And so America decides to literally relocate Japanese people, like legit Americans, into the middle of America, into camps to like keep an eye on them and stuff. And there's always a conversation around Holocaust versus internment, and I want to be really clear in that there is differentiating factors for this. A lot of the camps in the Holocaust were focused on extermination. You definitely have forced labor and things like that, but there was a focus on extermination, and you do not have that in internment camps. There are internment camps that allowed their literal prisoners, I guess would be the word for it. They go out and they can work in the broader city, literally we're kidnapping people and we're holding them prisoners and they technically haven't done anything. So this is definitely not a good mark on America. And in Korematsu versus the US, the Supreme Court's like, yeah, no, America can do that though. Like, that's a thing we can do. And that's not great. You can see in this image, this woman is standing in front of her, house, and it has a sign that says, Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. So yeah, racism also played a factor in this as well. And there are lots of examples of this throughout American history. You guys are a touch too young to remember the reaction out of 9/11, but there was a huge anti-Middle Eastern, Arabic, Muslim, the whole nine around 9/11. Hassan Minhaj has a special on Netflix that actually talks about his interaction with some of the people in his neighborhood and whatnot around this time period, targeting them specifically, even of course they did nothing to do with it. But there is a lot of that pushback because Americans are mad and they blame everyone of a certain color and whatnot for causing this. Another example is, look now, there's been a huge spike in attacks against Asian people because of the coronavirus, because it came from China, and so right? So racism clearly plays a factor in this. And I have up there, this is from an actual, defense production. America makes these propaganda films. We're going to watch a bunch of them over the next little bit, but focusing on, literally, they have scenes in there where they're like, these are Japanese people, and they can look at when the boats are coming and when the aircrafts are taking off, and they can send the word and there be attacks, so we need to relocate them. And sadly, America's like, that's fine. Okay, cool. I also am a little sad in having to do this. You may have very fond memories of as a child of Dr. Seuss and his, cartoons and stories and whatnot. Kind of racist. So Dr. Seuss has a big focus on American intervention. We're going to look at a few of his cartoons over time, and a lot of them are focused on America. We probably should get involved in this war, and we should not be anti-intervention. Because there are people who are like, nah, I don't want to get involved. Doesn't deal with us? Nah, I don't want to do it. And he's like, no, I think these are big deals and that we should get involved. But as you can see in this cartoon, he has racially depicted Japanese people. They are lined up across the entire Pacific Northwest down through California, and they're the honorable fifth column. They are lining up to get TNT, and there's a person looking out at Japan, quote, waiting for the signal from home. Literally this fear that all Japanese people in America are just secretly waiting for Japan to send some message, and then they'll just all lead attacks. So it's feelings like that that will help bring about those internment camps. We talk a lot about propaganda when it comes to the, German Nazis, Joseph Goebbels, and things like that. We're a little bit more, yeah, we do it too. The U.S. War Board is going to be significant. I have this little clip here from Captain America that I always think about, like the original Captain America, where literally he's like a tool of propaganda to try and get people to spend money on war bonds, which is basically you giving money to the government so that they can support the war. We have the the U.S. Office of War Information, which is focused on this propaganda, posters, comic books, leaflets, film, radio, etc. There's all sorts of different newsreels that'll run as well in like movie theaters at the beginning of movies to kind of show what's happening over there. We are going to see technology and especially, film, right? That ability to record video really be significant here compared to previous wars. And there will be the USO who will perform for the troops. And you'll see all sorts of examples of that moving on up through modern times. There's all sorts of examples from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan of comedians going over to the Middle East and performing for the troops. So that still is a thing. This is one of my favorite political cartoons from this time period. This is to get you to join a car sharing club today. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Just beautiful. One of the things that you will focus on with the propaganda is how can you try and change public perspective? And so what you're doing with this one is not necessarily trying to get people to think they're aligned with Hitler for not supporting it, but to try and make people self-conscious that they may come across as helping the war or being against the war effort because they're going to do selfish stuff. And that like public ostracization that can happen if they don't support the war effort. Two things with this cartoon. One, I think on its face you can see kind of aggressively racist, which, yep, a lot of them will be. But secondly, this is leveraging World War II to get you to not cause forest fires. So it says, our carelessness, their secret weapon, prevent forest fires. And so the focus is, well, if we have a bunch of forest fires happening, that's not going to be good for our war effort, so prevent forest fires. And so you'll see the use of that in all sorts of different campaigns that maybe sometimes don't even have to directly deal with World War II themselves.